Hi, I'm Adam in Wales and this is my board gaming vlog, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about runaway leaders in games, and specifically in game design, the different approaches that designers have taken to deal with this issue. So this is a list of 10 different ways that games in the past have dealt with the idea of a runaway leader, or a snowball effect as it's sometimes called. This tends to happen when we have a system whereby players who are doing well at the game are not only generating points or advantageous positions on a board, but they're also gaining special abilities or a sort of competitive advantage at the same time. So as they progress and they do better, they just get better and better and better, and it becomes harder and harder for the players who are losing the game to sort of make any ground. In fact, the game becomes harder for them to play, which accelerates this lead. The first option available to a designer, of course, is to just let this stuff happen. You know, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just a competitive advantage is the reward of doing well. Now, I think that's acceptable in a short game, and in fact, in many games, particularly sort of multiplayer solitaire so-called games, European games often, that is the case. If the game's only going to take half an hour, 45 minutes, and the player can gradually just get on with what they're doing, then perhaps it doesn't matter. And certainly in an abstract game, a two-player abstract game, commonly, yeah, if you're doing well, you're gaining more and more of an advantage, and actually what's happening is you're accelerating towards a finish. It may well be that both of us know who's going to win some way before we cross the finish line, but that doesn't matter as long as the duration isn't long. In a player elimination game, players who are doing badly or players who are behind the rest of the pack are actively removed from the game by the game mechanisms. So the player actually leaves the table, wanders off and does whatever they want to do, while the other players continue and finish off the game. This is generally out of vogue at the moment with modern board games. So it's something you see in old games like Monopoly and Risk, and then there are some modern board games, or games that people are still playing very much within the hobby, that hark back a little bit to that era. So Formula Day in the past, it's quite an old game actually, and that still has that player elimination in it. A more recent, very, very popular game would be King of Tokyo, which has player elimination. So a weak player is actively removed from the game, therefore they don't have to sit and watch a leader just get more and more powerful. Having looked at those two perhaps less than favourable options for dealing with this issue, let's take a look at Dominion and how this game does it. So in Dominion, the leading player is held back by a sort of a drag, a headwind. As they push on ahead and they're buying those high-valued points cards, what they're essentially doing is clogging up their deck, because the high-value points cards do nothing for them. In fact, the lower value, the low point cards are generally the most useful cards. So as I get further and further ahead in points, I'm slowing down, where the other players who haven't got as many points have probably got a more efficient deck, and their capability of gaining points is fast increasing, so they're going to gradually catch me. It's nicely balanced. But you're not going to get the runaway leader, because the runaway leader is constantly being sort of held back by this sense of swimming upstream against the tide. A very similar sort of concept to the previous entry is this idea of taxing the leader in some way, taking something away from the player in the lead. Now that's something that Dominion doesn't do. Dominion makes it harder for the leader to progress, but nothing's actively taken away. In the game Yinch, which is a two-player abstract game, the player actually loses playing pieces as they win rounds of the game. So in the later rounds, they're playing with fewer pieces than their opponent. They're handicapped for future rounds. Now that is, it's brilliantly incorporated into this. It works very well because it's an abstract game. But there are other games that do this which aren't abstracts. Most notably, Suburbia has a system, the city building game, where as you increase up the sort of scoring track, you're losing the potential to gain income. And so as you go up that scoring track, you're going to cross barriers that are going to reduce your income and are going to reduce your reputation and hence your population. And that's going to make it more and more difficult throughout the game because those barriers come more and more frequently as you advance up that scoring track. In essence, this acts as that same sort of headwind, that idea of fighting against the drag that you see in Dominion. But here stuff is being actively taken away from the player in the lead. If game mechanisms are able to give us the opportunity to steal from the rich, of course the other side of that coin is the opportunity to give to the poor. And there are some games which do that. Rather than punishing the player in the lead, what they do is give a leg up to the player that's behind. Now this is really a true catch-up mechanism. You see it throughout the game Kingsburg. In the game Kingsburg, the player who is doing the worst is constantly being given that leg up. There's even a phase in the game called Aid from the King, where the player who's got the fewest buildings will be given an additional dice, essentially one more worker than the other players, to help them to get back up there. Another game which features this sort of game mechanism whereby the players who are behind are being given something extra is the game Isle of Skye. This was the recent Kennespiel des Jahres winner in 2016. So in this tile-laying game, players in the later rounds of the game are given additional income if they're further back on the track. So they, and in fact, the further back on the track you are, the score track now, the more money that you're going to be given in those later rounds. And so you can really make quite a comeback in the later rounds, even if you've been behind throughout the rest of the game. So this is a game that has that mechanism really quite sort of visible, up front and centre. There's no sort of hiding that mechanism. It's there, and all players need to be aware of it throughout the game. In some games, as the player who is doing well advances through the game, what they actually do is spread themselves very thin, sometimes literally spreading out their troops across the board, and this makes them vulnerable, more vulnerable than the players who are losing, because you just don't have as many items available to you. So a classic example would be something like Small World, where as your empire sort of expands, what it actually means is you've got fewer and fewer sort of army units in each individual location in the board, and those units are very vulnerable to attacks. So this keeps that runaway leader in check. Many games work on the basis that they don't need any sort of catch-up mechanism because the player who's in the lead will be evident to all the other players, and so therefore the other players, assuming that it's a highly interactive game, will be able to attack that player, or whether that's in terms of direct conflict, battling, or whether that's in terms of outbidding them in auctions or something like that. The other players will essentially team up on the leader, bash the leader, and then that will bring the leader back and bring the other players into contention. So many games rely on this sort of mechanism. Of course, it can be a problem because there can be great cost to be the person doing that attack. So if we have a 3-player game, one player is getting ahead, so player A is getting ahead, player B decides they're going to step in and attack player A to reduce their lead. The person who benefits is player C, because player C hasn't had to use any resources in making that attack, hasn't had to place any effort on it. So this features in many, many games. One example would be the game Evolution, which I think uses this brilliantly. Although, when the leader becomes evident, other players can focus on that leader, it does take a lot of effort to do so. And there's lots of other mechanisms that are carefully built in there to balance this. So you may have an advantage by, for example, having a large body size in this game. Being a big creature is a huge advantage in terms of you can attack lots of other players. But it also makes you a target because other players are going to want to eat you. Because you're so big, you're going to provide them with lots and lots of food when you're attacked. So it's nicely balanced, but still relies on that mechanism of bash the leader. If you leave them alone, they're going to run away with the game. Another mechanism which is often used by games to ensure that everybody's in the game right up to the last minute is to ensure that the points scale throughout the game, so that in the early rounds there are only low value sort of benefits available, low point cards, things like that. Later in the game the big points come out, and so actually what we're doing in the early rounds is just sort of warming up a little bit. Later in the game, that's where the big stuff starts to happen. So you see this in games like Pie Mal Flauman, which is a a trick-taking sort of auction-style game from Pegasus, where we have 3 very specific decks of cards for the 3 rounds of the game. And as the game progresses, the points get more and more. So the later rounds are really important. And you can swing. That final round could take you from last position to first position. As long as you do well towards the end of the game, you can make up for your problems earlier in the game. Another example, perhaps more well known, is the game Seven Wonders. Again, played in 3 ages. And throughout those ages, both points and abilities escalate. So we have bigger battles in the final stages, we have bigger points, we have more valuable buildings coming out in the 3rd ages. So again, we have that sense of just warming up in those early stages, and then bam, the real competition is in age 3. Many games obscure who the leader is throughout the game anyway, so that you don't know who the leader is. So even if you're not in contention, you don't actually know about it. Again, it keeps everybody feeling involved until the end of the game. So a simple example would be Ticket to Ride. So in Ticket to Ride, you have hidden objectives, cards that you're working towards, and no one knows whether you completed those cards or not until the end of the game when you reveal them, and then we see who's in the lead. So there is in-game scoring, so we get an idea of how well we're doing, but at the end that can all change when those cards are revealed. Very similar happens in the game Trois, a much more sort of involved Euro game, where at the end of the game we reveal hidden secret objectives. But my favourite example of this mechanism is the game Haben Gut. Haben Gut is a stock market game, and in this game the player who wins is the person with the most money at the end of the game. So far that seems fairly clear. But there's a big twist, because throughout the game you've got to gradually give a bit of money to charity, and it's not immediately clear how much everybody has given to charity. At the end of the game, the player who's given the least to charity is going to be eliminated from the game, even if they've got the most money overall. So you can never be sure. Even if you've got loads of money, maybe that means you've been the least generous, you've given the least to charity, and you're actually going to come in last place, even though you've got the most money. You're going to be eliminated from the final scoring. It's brilliantly done, and it turns this into what is already a very, very interesting game into something that's just fantastic. Now the final example, and I think the one that people are going to be most familiar with when they think about catch-up mechanisms, people think about Power Grid, because Power Grid has that brilliant turn order mechanism whereby the player who's in the most the furthest back on the score chart, I suppose, the person who's doing the least well, is actually going to have all the advantageous positions in turn order. So in this game, that turns into a strategy, because players deliberately hold back a little bit. They don't want to take the lead, because taking the lead is going to disadvantage you throughout the game. So they hold back. They wait. When is the point where they want to go ahead? It's essentially, if we think about that cycling thing, I talked about headwind previously. The person in front is going slow. They're struggling because they've got the disadvantage in terms of turn order in every phase. So you're better to sit in second place. There, in second place, you've got a lot of the advantage, but you're also benefiting from a more advantageous turn order as well. And then you can make your final sprint towards the end of the game and hopefully win. So that features in Power Grid. It features in Power Grid the First Sparks, and I mentioned previously Kingsburg. Kingsburg does a bit of this as well. He uses turn order, perhaps not in quite such a sophisticated way as Power Grid does it, but it's a really clever way of keeping people in contention and just providing that slight drag for the leader in the game. So where does this leave us? Well, I suppose in short games we're not going to worry about it too much. It doesn't matter if someone runs away with a victory. It doesn't matter if we know who's going to win some way before the end of the game. It also doesn't matter if I'm eliminated from the game, if it's a short game. As long as I don't have to sit around for hours feeling rotten about my miserable attempt at playing the game, then that doesn't matter. But in the longer games, then it becomes an issue, particularly the games with less player interaction. With a lot of player interaction, we can rely a little bit on that bash your leader mechanism. As long as it's balanced, as long as we're not giving an advantage to the player who turtles away in the corner, then that can do some of the work for us. But if we've got a game which doesn't have that much interaction, which is one of those classic European sort of multiplayer solitaire games, then we're going to have to rely on that sort of drag, the beautiful sort of elegant mechanism we see in Dominion, where things just get harder. Or we might have to go for the slightly more blatant tax the leader, take stuff from them, or give stuff to the person who's behind. The problem with those two mechanisms being that it can feel a little bit unjust. Okay, if I'm doing really, really well, why am I being punished for it? Or if they're doing really, really badly, why are they being rewarded for it? Now, essentially, this all works out the same. It's still that headwind thing, and as long as players know up front that it's going to happen, they can build it into their strategy. But it still feels slightly odd sometimes in those games. Power Grid, not so much, because players use it as a strategy frequently. It's one of the first things you learn about Power Grid is that it's not advantageous to be in the lead from the very beginning. Some players can make it work, but the majority will hold back a little bit. It's one of the key strategies in the game. It's not just a case of rewarding somebody who's doing badly. Actually, sitting back is part of the gameplay. Hidden information is always wonderful, of course. So games like Ticket to Ride and Haben Good and Trois, they're excellent. It makes the players feel like they're still involved, but you don't really know who the leader is. And this is helpful in preventing analysis paralysis as well. Another problem with some games where a player will sit for ages taking their turn, trying to calculate who's in the lead, how can I get the maximum possible number of points. Of course, if you've got hidden information, they can't make those calculations. They're going to have to rely on instinct and intuition, and that makes the game run much, much quicker. As long as it doesn't mean that ultimately the player wins based on luck, I think that's not such a problem. Those escalating points systems, that works very, very well. As long as the players know that that's going to happen from the outset, nobody feels cheated by it. We know that those starting rounds are just about getting things in order, and then the later rounds is where it's really happening. And this is actually the effect of games like Isle of Skye, where later in the game, the players who are behind are being given a real benefit and a real leg up. What that means is that the final rounds of the game is where the game is decided. Those early rounds are just jostling a little bit for position, and then the real thing, the real sprint, is at the end of the game. So it just sort of, it gives that escalating sort of feel and gives the game some momentum. Now, a lot of this is a matter of taste. Some people don't like catch-up mechanisms at all. This concept of sort of rubber banding, springing back into contention, as I say, it feels very unjust. Other people, well, I hate sitting in a game for hours knowing that I'm going to lose. I want to feel like there's a chance I can make that comeback. And as long as that chance is not overpowering and it doesn't frequently result in wins being snatched away from the real worthy player, then I think it's a good thing. And it's certainly something that we need to consider when we're designing games. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this vlog. I'm Adam in Wales, and if you'd like to watch any of my other videos, watch Adam's Board Game Wales on YouTube, and please subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter @BoardGameWales, and on Board Game Geek I'm Adam78. So thank you very much for watching, and all the best.